The glittering chandeliers cast golden reflections across the marble floors of the Hamilton estate, where New York's elite gathered for what was supposed to be the social event of the season. I smoothed down my carefully chosen designer dress, a deep burgundy number that had cost 3 months of my savings, and took a deep breath before stepping through those imposing double doors. At 17, this was my first time attending one of these high society gatherings. Mom had been hesitant about letting me come, but Dad insisted it would be good networking for my college applications. "Just be yourself," he'd said with that warm smile of his, straightening his tie as he headed off to his late-night meeting. If only I'd known then how prophetic those words would become. The first hour wasn't so bad. I kept to myself, observing the choreographed dance of social politics from beside a potted plant. The women wore dresses that probably cost more than my car, their jewelry catching the light with every practiced laugh. The men huddled in groups, discussing stock portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons. Then came the moment that would change everything. I was reaching for a glass of sparkling cider when I heard it, the first whispered comment. "Who let her in?" A girl in a baby blue dress asked her friend, loud enough for me to hear. "This isn't exactly her." "Seen," the friend giggled, twirling her pearl necklace. I pretended not to notice, but my hands were shaking as I lifted the glass to my lips. More whispers followed, each one sharper than the last. Did she win some kind of charity raffle? Maybe she's one of the catering staff who forgot to change. The words cut deeper than they should have, but I held my head high, just like Mom taught me. But the real drama unfolded when Bradley Wellington AD, yes, that's actually his name, approached me with a smirk that spelled trouble. "You know," he drawled, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I think you might have gotten the wrong invitation. The community center event is next weekend." The surrounding laughter felt like ice water down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Years of debate team practice abandoned me in that crucial moment. My vision blurred with unwanted tears as I noticed phones being pulled out, ready to capture my humiliation for their privileged social media circles. That's when the atmosphere in the room shifted. The massive doors swung open, and the clicking of expensive shoes against marble echoed through the suddenly silent hall. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I recognized those footsteps from countless mornings hearing them come down our breakfast stairs. The whispers took on a different tone now. "Is that? It can't be. Oh my God!" The color drained from Bradley's face as he stared past me, his smug expression crumbling like a sandcastle in the rain. The familiar scent of Dad's cologne reached me before his hand gently touched my shoulder. "Princess," he said, his voice carrying across the dead-silent room. "I finished my meeting early and thought I'd join you." He looked around the room, his presence commanding attention without effort. After all, when one of the most powerful venture capitalists in the country walks into a room, people tend to notice. But this story isn't about my father's influence or watching those smirks turn to stammered apologies. It's about what happened next, a moment that would teach everyone present, including me, an unforgettable lesson about judgment, power, and the true meaning of class. The silence in that ballroom was thick enough to cut with a knife as Dad's hand remained steady on my shoulder. I could feel the weight of every stare, the collective held breath of New York's supposedly unshakable elite. Dad's presence alone had transformed the atmosphere from one of cruel amusement to tense anticipation. What happened in the next few minutes would later be whispered about in every prestigious boardroom from Manhattan to Silicon Valley. But first, let me tell you about my father, a man whose story these people clearly didn't know, despite his name being on half their investment portfolios. 25 years ago, he started with nothing but a laptop and an idea in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, while other kids had trust funds. I grew up watching Dad pull all-nighters, building his company from the ground up. Mom would bring him coffee at 3 a.m., and they'd talk about their dreams for hours. Those early years taught me that true wealth isn't about designer labels or summer homes. It's about dignity, determination, and doing what's right. Bradley Wellington IE was still frozen in place, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. His father, I noticed, was making his way across the room with the desperate speed of someone who just realized they'd made a terrible mistake. You see, Wellington Sr. had a meeting with Dad next week about a rather crucial investment in his struggling tech startup. I believe, Dad said, his voice carrying that calm authority that had closed billion-dollar deals. We haven't been properly introduced. He extended his hand to Bradley, who looked like he might faint. Though I must say, your welcome message to my daughter was quite memorable. The phones that had been poised to capture my humiliation had disappeared as quickly as summer internships might for certain people in this room. The girl in the baby blue dress was suddenly very interested in her shoes, which probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But my father wasn't done. He surveyed the room with those observant eyes that had spotted unicorn startups before anyone else. You know, he continued, his voice taking on that thoughtful tone he used when teaching me life lessons, I've always believed that character reveals itself in how we treat others when we think they can't benefit us. The implications of his words hung in the air like the crystal chandelier above us, beautiful but potentially devastating if it fell. Several people shifted uncomfortably, no doubt remembering their own contributions to the earlier scene. Mom chose that exact moment to make her entrance, and if Dad's arrival had silenced the room, Mom's presence enchanted it. She wore her signature red dress, the same one she wore to accept her Humanitarian of the Year award for her work in education reform. Her warm smile could have lit up Central Park, but there was steel behind it. As she gracefully joined us, I watched realization dawn on several faces. They weren't just dealing with a powerful investor. They were facing a power couple whose influence stretched from Wall Street to Washington. The same people who had sneered at me minutes ago were now desperately trying to catch my parents' attention with awkward smiles and half-raised hands. But the real story was just beginning to unfold, because what nobody in that room knew, not even my parents, was that I had my own cards to play. You see, that morning I made a discovery that would shake the foundations of several family dynasties present in that very room. And as I stood there, watching this social hierarchy crumble and reshape itself around us, I wondered if they were ready for what was coming next. The question wasn't whether I belonged in their world anymore. The question was whether their world was ready for what I was about to reveal. As my parents worked the room with the practiced ease of people who belonged everywhere, I excused myself to the powder room, my phone feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my clutch. The evidence I'd stumbled upon that morning wasn't just scandalous, it was life-changing. During my internship at the city's top financial newspaper, I discovered something buried in public records that connected several families in this very room to a scheme that would make headlines for months. When I returned, the dynamic had shifted again. The same people who'd mocked me were now trying to engage in conversation, their smiles strained and eyes calculating. Bradley Wellington III had positioned himself near the dessert table, clearly hoping to catch my father's attention for damage control. His father was frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to salvage next week's meeting. The girl in the baby blue dress, whose name I'd learned was Charlotte, actually approached me with an apology so sugary it could have frosted the untouched cake on her plate. "I just didn't recognize you," she gushed, as if that made her behavior acceptable. "We should totally get coffee sometime." I smiled politely, knowing that in less than 24 hours our family's carefully constructed social facade would crumble. The documents on my phone proved that several of these families, including hers, had been involved in an elaborate art fraud scheme, using their galleries to inflate prices and evade taxes. The same galleries that had refused to showcase talented artists from underprivileged backgrounds. Mom caught my eye from across the room, giving me that look that asked if I was okay. I nodded slightly, but she must have seen something in my expression because she started making her way over. She'd always said I had a terrible poker face. Ironically, that's exactly what had helped me spot the discrepancies in those gallery records. The live band started playing a softer melody, and couples moved to the dance floor. Dad was now engaged in conversation with Mr. Wellington, whose forehead was showing beads of sweat despite the room's perfect temperature. I watched as other parents steered their children toward my father, probably hoping to secure internships or investment meetings. That's when Trevor Richardson, the host's son and Bradley's best friend, grabbed the microphone from the band. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice slightly slurred from one too many drinks, "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room." The crowd turned, curiosity and anxiety mingling in the air. My heart started racing. Trevor had been copied on certain emails I'd found, emails that detailed exactly how their families had manipulated the art market. Was he about to expose everything before I could properly break the story? Or was this just another attempt at public humiliation? Mom was still 3 groups of people away. Dad had stopped mid-conversation, his expression unreadable. The room held its breath as Trevor swayed slightly on the small stage, his next words threatening to either maintain or destroy the careful balance of power in this glittering ballroom. I clutched my phone tighter, knowing I had 2 choices. I could let Trevor control the narrative, potentially twisting everything to save himself, or I could step forward now and take control of the situation. The evidence in my hands could reshape the landscape of New York's elite society, but the timing had to be perfect. The weight of the moment pressed down on me as Trevor lifted the microphone again, his next words about to set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The question was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? As my parents worked the room with their natural grace, I felt the USB drive in my clutch purse grow heavier with each passing moment. 3 days ago, during my internship at the Wellington Global Tech office, I'd stumbled upon some interesting files while organizing the digital archives. It wasn't snooping, not really, when the documents practically fell into my lap due to someone's careless cloud storage settings. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Bradley Wellington I had been busy looking down his nose at people, his father's company had been cutting corners in ways that would make front-page news. The evidence showed that several prominent families in this very room had been involved in a scheme that diverted funds meant for inner-city tech education programs into their private accounts. My hands trembled slightly as I watched Bradley's father laugh too loudly at one of Dad's jokes, his forehead shining with nervous sweat. He had no idea that his son's cruel comments tonight had just accelerated my timeline. Originally, I'd planned to anonymously share my findings with the proper authorities next week. But now it felt like the universe had handed me this moment. Mom caught my eye from across the room, giving me that look that always seemed to read my mind. She taught me that timing was everything, in business and life, and especially in moments of truth. Choose your battles wisely, she'd always said, but when you fight, fight with purpose. The chamber orchestra had started playing again, but the music felt distant as I watched the scene unfold. The same people who'd whispered insults about me were now practically tripping over themselves to introduce their sons and daughters. A girl who had rolled her eyes at my presence earlier now insisted we take a selfie together. The fakery of it all made my stomach turn. Dad was in his element, discussing investment strategies with a group of eager listeners. But I noticed how his eyes regularly scanned the room to check on me, just like he'd done when I was learning to ride a bike. He'd always let me fall and get back up on my own, knowing it would make me stronger. Tonight was no different. He was letting me handle this my way. The Wellington family's annual contribution to the education fund was due to be announced in exactly 15 minutes. It was always the highlight of these gatherings, a performative display of generosity that the press ate up every year. Bradley's father was already making his way to the small stage, index cards in hand, ready to proclaim his family's dedication to improving educational access for all. My heart pounded as I opened my clutch purse, fingers brushing against the USB drive. In the past hour, I'd watched these people pivot from cruel judgment to desperate networking, all based on who they thought I was, but they had no idea who I was about to become. The room hushed as Mr. Wellington tapped the microphone. "Distinguished guests," he began, his voice echoing through the ballroom, "it is my great honor to continue our family's tradition of supporting tomorrow's leaders." I took a deep breath and started walking toward the stage. Mom's eyes widened slightly. She knew that walk. It was the same determined stride she used when she was about to change the world. Dad straightened his tie, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They didn't know what I was about to do, but they trusted me to do what was right. The question wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about showing everyone in this room that their actions, whether kind or cruel, had consequences. As I climbed the steps to the stage, Bradley's father paused mid-sentence, his practiced smile faltering. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Little did they know, I was about to redefine what power really meant in their world. The screens above us filled with video clips, emails, and financial records, years of carefully documented evidence revealing a web of corruption that went far beyond just the education fund scandal. Bradley's hands had stopped shaking as he narrated each damning piece of evidence, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. The irony of my former tormentor becoming an unlikely ally wasn't lost on anyone in the room. What unfolded in the next 20 minutes would later be called the Hamilton Estate revelation by the press. But they'd get most of the details wrong. They wouldn't capture how Mrs. Wellington collapsed into a nearby chair, or how 3 board members tried to make a break for the terrace only to be politely escorted back inside by DHN's team. I started documenting everything last year, Bradley explained, his voice echoing through the now silent ballroom. After I overheard my father threatening to cut funding to Brooklyn Tech unless they changed their admission policies to favor certain families. He looked at me then, real remorse in his eyes. I acted horrible tonight because I knew you were the intern who'd accessed those files. I thought you were going to expose everything before I could finish gathering all the evidence. Dad stepped forward, his presence commanding attention even in this chaos. Richard, he addressed Mr. Wellington, his voice carrying that same calm authority he used in board meetings. You didn't just steal from education funds. You stole opportunities from thousands of kids who deserved a chance. But then came the moment that changed everything. Again, Mom walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a judge's gavel. Sarah, she addressed DHN, I believe this is where I should step in. The room collectively gasped as Mom pulled out her own phone. As the newly appointed head of the Education Reform Commission, I've been running a parallel investigation for the past 6 months. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. All those late-night phone calls, the mysterious meetings, Mom's insistence that I take that specific internship at Wellington Global Tech. My parents had known all along, but they'd let me find my own way to the truth. They'd let me stand up for myself, even when they could have ended this before it began. DHN smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her all night. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, what you're witnessing isn't just the exposure of one corrupt scheme. This is the culmination of a year-long joint operation between the DA's office and the Education Reform Commission. The evidence from all 3 sources, Bradley's recordings, my USB drive, and Mom's investigation, painted a picture so complete that even the best lawyers in the room knew there was no wiggling out of this one. One by one, the implicated parties were quietly escorted from the ballroom, their faces a mix of resignation and disbelief. But the final twist came from the most unexpected source. Bradley's younger sister Claire, who'd been quietly observing everything, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. There's more, she said softly, pulling out a journal. Dad, remember when you said I was wasting my time volunteering at those underprivileged schools? I kept track of every student who was denied admission because of your schemes, every single one. The journal contained names, dreams, and stories, the human cost of all this corruption. And as Claire read out those stories, the remaining party guests were forced to confront the real impact of their privileged bubble. Standing there, watching this house of cards collapse, I realized something profound. Real power isn't about who can push others down. It's about who has the courage to lift others up. My father's hand found my shoulder again, but this time it wasn't to defend me. It was to tell me he was proud of how I'd defended myself and others. The night ended not with the planned champagne toast, but with the quiet satisfaction of truth finally coming to light. As we left the Hamilton estate, Mom, Dad, and I walked past the reporters already gathering outside. Bradley and Claire joined us, all of us together, an unlikely group united by the choice to do what was right rather than what was easy. Sometimes, I realized, the greatest power moves aren't the ones that make the loudest noise, but the ones that change the game entirely. And as we drove home under the city lights, I knew that while one chapter of privilege and corruption had ended, a new chapter of real change was just beginning. 6 months after that unforgettable night at the Hamilton estate, I stood at the podium of Brooklyn Tech's auditorium, looking out at a sea of eager faces. The school's new merit-based admission program had just accepted its first truly diverse class, and I'd been asked to speak at their orientation. Among the faces in the crowd, I spotted Bradley and Claire, who'd become unexpected but dedicated allies in rebuilding what their father had tried to destroy. The Wellington scandal had dominated headlines for weeks, but the real story wasn't about corruption exposed. It was about what came after. Dad had redirected his venture capital fund to prioritize educational technology startups founded by graduates from public schools. Mom's Education Reform Commission had implemented new transparency measures across all private school funding programs in the state. And me, well, I'd found my voice in ways I never expected. That USB drive from the party now sat on my desk at home, a reminder that sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence can spark the biggest changes. But it was Claire's journal that had the most impact. Those stories she'd collected became the foundation for a mentorship program connecting privileged kids with peers they might never have met otherwise. Watching former party guests' children now voluntarily tutoring at community centers showed how quickly things could change when people opened their eyes. Bradley had surprised everyone by declining his acceptance to an Ivy League school, choosing instead to work full-time with education advocacy groups. My father's name might be mud now, he told me one day over coffee, but maybe the next generation of Wellingtons can stand for something better. His honesty in coming forward had inspired others. 3 more wealthy families had since exposed similar schemes at their children's private schools. The investigation ultimately revealed that over $50 million had been diverted from various education funds over the years. But the real cost had been in lost opportunities, thousands of bright kids who'd been denied chances they deserved. That's why today mattered so much. Looking at the newly admitted students, I saw the change we'd fought for. Faces of every color, kids from every borough, all chosen purely on merit. Dad sat in the front row, beaming with that quiet pride I'd grown to recognize. Mom was busy in Washington, pushing for national legislation to prevent similar scandals. But she'd sent me a text that morning. Remember, sweetheart, strength isn't about having power. It's about how you use it. As I began my speech, I couldn't help but think about how differently that party could have ended if I'd chosen revenge over justice, or if Bradley had chosen loyalty to his father over what was right. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that force us to be bigger than our hurt. Your acceptance to this school, I told the students, isn't just about your test scores or grades. It's about restoring faith in a system that should have been fair all along. Each of you earned your spot here, not because of your last name or your family's bank account, but because of your potential. Later that evening, as I walked through the Brooklyn streets with Dad, we passed by that tiny apartment where he'd started his company. You know, he said, stopping to look up at the window, true power isn't about making others feel small. It's about helping others reach their full height. I smiled, thinking about how far we'd all come from that night at the Hamilton estate. The whispers and stares had tried to make me feel small, but they'd only revealed how small that world had been all along. Sometimes it takes standing up to the wrong kind of power to discover the right kind of strength. And that's the real story, not about scandals or corruption or even justice served. It's about how change happens when people choose to be bigger than the boxes others try to put them in. Because in the end, true class isn't about which party you get invited to, it's about what you do when you're there.